Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in a library, or even a sleepy village. No, this is the hush of stone walls and dirt roads, of long skirts rustling past shuttered windows, of a candle flickering low in a world that forgot to write your name down. You're wandering the winding lanes of a medieval town, where the stories of women were mostly whispered, scribbled in margins, or erased entirely. But they were there. You just have to lean in close to hear them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're still awake enough to type. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing just outside a small timber-framed house. It's early evening, and the air smells like damp earth, smoked meat, and the lingering sweetness of crushed lavender. The town is quiet, save for the distant clatter of hooves and the sharp squeal of a pig objecting to something you don't want to know about. You step carefully between puddles. Every surface seems a little damp, like the whole village is exhaling. Behind that door, a woman stirs a pot. That's her whole day, you might think. But you're wrong. That woman, let's call her Marjorie, is the quiet engine of this household. And she knows exactly how many eggs she can trade for fish, which neighbors are fighting, and what time the tax collector walks by. She's not just cooking, she's calculating. Most medieval women didn't get their names in the history books, unless they were queens or criminals. But walk through any medieval town and you'll see them everywhere, hauling water, running stalls, tending goats, teaching children, hiding letters in bodices, and haggling with such passive-aggressive finesse that you'd swear it was genetic. They're just hard to spot, because the history was mostly written by men who were too busy chronicling wars to notice someone reinventing porridge. You pass a well. Two women are gossiping in low tones, with that careful, polite venom reserved for in-laws and distant cousins. One rolls her eyes. You can tell by their body language that something big just happened. Maybe a band's announcement, maybe a cow-related disaster. Their husbands, probably oblivious, discussing taxes or bad beer at the inn. But this is where the real diplomacy happens. Inside the church, candles sputter. A few women are on their knees, murmuring prayers. You might think they're just repeating Latin out of obligation, but one of them is quietly slipping a tiny folded scrap of parchment into the hem of her sleeve. A prayer, yes, but also maybe a plea. Maybe even a confession, too dangerous to say aloud. Historians still argue whether these whispered rituals were just pious habit or coded forms of emotional survival. Back in the marketplace, you pass a girl selling herbs from a low basket. She's maybe 12, and she's clearly been told what to say. Healing for coughs, good for cramps, and makes your hair shine. Her grin is all gap-toothed charm, but she doesn't say. What she's learned from her grandmother is that too much of that herb can stop a pregnancy, and that some midwives call it moonseed in hushed voices. Not that the church approves. But the church isn't the one raising 7 children on oatmeal and second-hand onions. The buildings lean in, crowding you. Overhead, laundry flaps like defeated flags. There's a sound, soft footsteps on stone. You glance left. A woman in a gray cloak walks briskly, chin down, hands hidden. Is she a widow? A nun in disguise? A trader from the next town over? You'll never know, because she's already vanished around the corner. Just like in the records. Here's a weird thing. We actually know more about some medieval women from their shoes than their diaries. Leather soles, worn smooth by years of walking. Stitch patterns that suggest arthritis. Corns, or one leg slightly shorter than the other. Some archaeologists say those shoes tell stories. Others say it's reading too much into scraps. But when the voices are gone, what else do we have? You duck into a shadowed archway as rain begins to fall. Soft, gentle, almost apologetic. A woman, nearby, closes her shutters. You hear the soft thunk of wood, the click of a latch, and the long sigh of someone settling in for the night. Behind that shutter, she may be spinning wool, or plucking lice from a child's hair, or reading a psalter by candlelight. Maybe she's remembering the story her aunt told her about a girl who kissed a knight and got away with it, or didn't. Memory is fuzzy, especially when it's filtered through generations and bedtime. Stories. You lean against the stone and feel the cool dampness sink into your cloak. Your eyes are drawn to a carving, something small, worn, and nearly invisible. A woman, etched in the corner of a column. Not a saint, not a queen. Just ... a face. Maybe someone loved her once. Maybe someone prayed to her. Or maybe a bored mason carved her one day, then got back to work on the flying buttress. That's the thing. History hides in the quiet places. In the half-finished embroidery. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, where monks doodled cats chasing mice, and once famine, nun riding a fish. In bones that show childbirth injuries, in teeth worn down from grinding grain, in a small lead brooch, shaped like a heart. None of it shouts. It just waits for you to notice. You keep walking, past doorways, past lives. You hear laughter behind. A wooden wall, then the sound of weeping. Same voice. Maybe just a shift in memory. Maybe the same moment. You're not walking alone, exactly. You're walking with ghosts who never got to be heroines. They were too busy making breakfast. And as your steps slow and the rain deepens, you feel the first real hush of nightfall settle over the town like a quilt. You're part of it now. The silence. The whispers. The secret history of people, history forgot. You wake up if you were ever really asleep, just in time to hear the town stir again. Not with urgency, but with the habitual rhythm of dawn. It's not roosters that wake you, but the thunk of buckets in the well, and the creak of a cellar door opening somewhere nearby. Women are already moving, feet slapping against packed dirt floors, hair hastily braided or bundled under linen caps. You rub your eyes and follow the smell of yeast and smoke toward the market square, where a quiet revolution is taking place. Disguised as a pot of ale. At the heart of it all stands Agnes. You don't know her name yet, but she's the one stirring the cauldron-sized kettle of ale behind her thatched cottage. The scent is deep and earthy, somewhere between wet bread and grassy spice. She'd pour this into clay jugs and send her daughter hobbling off to sell them in the square. It's just beer, right? Wrong. In towns like this, women don't just drink it, they brew it, sell it, and know exactly how long it keeps before it starts to taste like shoe. You glance over at the wool stall nearby, where another woman is teasing tufts of raw fleece into thread. It looks slow, tedious, mind-numbing. But her fingers move with steady grace, the kind that comes from doing something every single day of your life. It's not just cloth she's making, it's income. Wool drives this economy, and guess who's been spinning it while knights run around jousting in fields? Yeah, not the guys in shiny metal. Historians often gloss over this part. Probably because spinning wool and brewing ale doesn't sound as sexy as swordplay or divine visions. But this is where the medieval economy breathes. Women weren't just assistants. They ran things. Officially, no. On paper, definitely not. But ask anyone in the square who to talk to if you want eggs, a cure for your cough, or gossip about which neighbor is cursed this week. And they'll all point to someone's mother, wife, or grandmother. You pass a booth with dyed cloth fluttering like tired prayer flags. The woman selling them is laughing with another over something scandalous, judging by the sudden snort and the way she covers her mouth. You lean in. Something about a merchant's wife and a missing comb. The details don't matter. What matters is this gossip is currency. It keeps women informed, socially safe, and occasionally just entertained enough to get through another day of pickling turnips. Scholars still argue whether medieval women used gossip primarily as a survival mechanism or as a form of social resistance. Was it petty or was it power? Honestly, sometimes it was both. Sure, it could wreck reputations, but it could also protect women from isolation, warn them of danger, or shift alliances in their favor. That seemingly idle chatter over ale cups and spinning wheels, it might have saved someone from a bad marriage, or sent a cheater packing. You watch a customer approach Agnes's ale stand. He's a red-faced man with boots to clean to be from this town. She greets him with a curtsy that's half-hearted at best. He starts haggling, but she cuts him off with a price and a raised eyebrow. She doesn't need his coin that badly. She's already sold 3 jugs this morning. The customer grumbles, pays, and walks away. Agnes mutters something under her breath that sounds suspiciously anatomical. Here's the fun bit. For a long time brewing was considered women's work, until it got profitable. Once male brewers and guilds realized there was money in it, they started pushing women out. They said women weren't sanitary, that they used magic, that their beer was bad luck. One day, you're running the town's ale supply. The next, you're being accused of witchcraft because your barley batch was too strong. Medieval marketing was brutal. Still, women adapted. They teamed up, they sold from home, they whispered warnings to each other about bad inspectors or jealous neighbors. One woman's spilled malt was another's cautionary tale. You pause at a stall, selling bread. The woman here is older, her hands veined and flour-dusted, her eyes sharp. She's speaking to her son in clipped sentences while slipping something extra into a regular customer's pouch. A hint of favoritism, maybe. Maybe the customer helped her once. Or maybe she's playing her own quiet game of influence. You can't tell, but you suspect she knows everything that happens in this square by lunchtime. There's a fringe detail. Most people forget. Women often worked cooperatively in informal labor guilds, little networks of weavers, bakers, or dyers who looked out for one another. Nothing official, of course. No one wrote it down. But if you followed the breadcrumbs literally and figuratively, you'd find a pattern of mutual aid, disguised as helping a neighbor. A few stalls down, someone's selling candles thick ones, thin ones, some that smell like beeswax, and others that definitely don't. The woman here has ink-stained fingers. Curious, you glance at her basket beneath the counter. A tiny notebook hastily closed, writing, or maybe just ledgers. Still, any literacy at all is suspiciously radical in a world where a woman reading Latin is enough to make some monks sweat. You overhear part of a joke. Something about a friar, a goose, and a terrible haircut. It's funny, but not just funny. There's always a second layer. These women speak in riddles when necessary, veil criticism in humor, and keep just enough plausible deniability to avoid trouble. When public life doesn't belong to you, you learn to exist between the lines. And so the day rolls on. The market buzzes, children chase chickens through mud, and women keep doing what they've always done, everything. They feed, barter, calculate, whisper, joke, and judge. You get the sense that if all the women vanished tomorrow, this town would fall apart before the bell rang for supper. And yet, history keeps calling them footnotes. Assistants, background, but you've walked through their world now. You've seen who's holding it up. One hand kneading dough, the other taking notes no one will ever read. You blink, and suddenly the square begins to empty. Not quickly, just the natural ebb of business as the sun leans west. Agnes lifts her last jug of ale and stretches her back with a grimace. A boy trips over a goat and gets yelled at. Somewhere. Behind you, laughter rises again, sharp, sudden, and thoroughly knowing. You've spent a day among the backbone of the medieval world, and no one even asked your name. The streets narrow as you drift away from the market square into the quieter corners of town, where the cobblestones are cracked and the doorways lean like tired shoulders. It's cooler here, shaded by stone buildings and the long shadows of tall, unfamiliar structures. At first glance, it might seem like just another quiet alley, but then you hear it. The soft shuffle of slippers on tile, the rustle of habits, and the faint chanting of psalms echoing behind thick oak doors. You've found the convent. You don't knock people, like you don't usually get invited in, but tonight, the door creaks open anyway. You slip inside. The air is cool, perfumed with beeswax and incense. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings, not urgently, but with that sleepy insistence of a daily rhythm that never quite stops. Women in gray and white habits glide past you like ghosts, with very real to-do lists. These are the women who escaped marriage not always by choice and found themselves instead in the holy echo chamber of convent walls. You might imagine a medieval nun's life as a blend of prayer and stillness. And, well, yes, if by stillness you mean being constantly busy while trying to look serene. They copied manuscripts, ran infirmaries, educated girls, and grew herbs that suspiciously doubled as both medicinal treatments and birth control. Prayer was just the starting point. One sister sits hunched at a desk, ink on her fingers and a candle dangerously low. She's not just copying scripture. Look closely between the Latin verses. She's doodling vines in the margins, little birds, and ... Is that a rude bunny? Medieval nuns had a surprising sense of humor, and it shows. In the illuminations, they accidentally slipped into sacred texts. You've never seen so many tiny swords poking so many frogs. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were personal rebellion or just bored artistry, but the truth is probably a bit of both. These weren't just passive women locked away from the world. They were highly literate, fiercely observant, and often quietly radical. Some wrote treatises. Some challenged theological norms. One even claimed to receive direct visions from God that made male clergy deeply uncomfortable. Of course, not all nuns were devout by nature. Many were placed here by families, eager to avoid a dowry or hide a scandal. There's always one girl in every convent who arrived fuming, arms crossed, determined to break every rule and sneak out by Michaelmas. But eventually, even she falls into rhythm chant, scrub, read, sleep, maybe with a little midnight wine, and secret letters smuggled in the breadbasket. Speaking of letters, you pass a scriptorium table where two nuns are whispering, heads together. One is folding parchment, the other is giggling. This could be a theological debate, but judging by the blush on the younger one's cheeks, it's far more likely a love poem, perhaps passed from the outside world through a sympathetic brother, or a friendly merchant. Nuns weren't immune to feelings, just exceptionally good at disguising them behind layers of ritual. The convent has its own internal drama too. You don't hear shouting, but you feel it in the sidelong glances, the subtle clearing of throats when someone walks by. Sister Amisha hoards honey. Sister Joan takes too long in the garden with the herbalist, and everyone suspects the abbess has a stash of almond sweets hidden behind her psalter. Power in here is delicate, whispered, and deeply medieval mean girls, but with more Latin. You step into the garden. A walled plot of soil and greenery, almost painfully peaceful. Lavender, rue, rosemary, and yarrow grow in neat rows, buzzing with bees and quietly tended by a novice with dirt-smudged fingers and an expression of concentration usually reserved for chess players or bomb disposal experts. She plucks one sprig, sniffs it, and slips it into a pouch. For healing, for an elixir, for hexing that one nun who keeps singing off-key at vespers. No one says. There's a quiet power here, built on repetition. Morning bells, matins, study meals, prayers, work, prayers again, sleep, maybe. It sounds dull, but this routine carved out space for reflection, for knowledge, and for women to simply exist beyond their traditional roles. In here, a woman didn't need to be someone's wife or daughter. She could just be herself, plus a lot of chores and psalms. And don't think for a second this was some feminist utopia. The church hierarchy was still male. The rules were still strict. And if a nun stepped too far out of line, say, by questioning doctrine or hoarding bookshay, could be punished with silence, solitary confinement, or worse. Still, the convent was one of the few places where women could control land, teach, write, and lead. In some cases, abbesses had more local power than bishops, and they knew it. You pass a chapel, quiet and empty, except for one woman kneeling alone. Her lips move silently. She's not weeping, but her eyes are closed in that way that tells you she's somewhere very far from here. Maybe she's praying for a child she never had, or for a sister still trapped in an unhappy marriage. Or maybe she's asking God to strike down Brother Thomas, who condescendingly told her last week that women weren't meant to teach scripture. Who knows? As you turn to leave, the door you came through has been closed. Another opens ahead. That's the thing about convents. They're full of doors you didn't see until you're already walking through them. You step back into the town, blinking in the early dusk. Outside, people rush to finish chores before dark. Inside, the sisters will soon gather for Copland. That final breath of the day, where voices rise in sacred harmony, and the whole convent exhales together. You pause, just long enough to hear it. A wall of soft voices, a blend of prayer and rest. You wonder how many secrets have passed through that place. How many forbidden words. How many sighs swallowed into silence. How many poems etched between the lines of obedience. You keep walking, and for a while, the town seems quieter. Or maybe you're just listening differently now. Your path winds out of the shadow of the convent, and into a street with fewer candles burning in the windows, and more shutters drawn tightly closed. It's quieter, here not sacred, quiet like inside the cloister walls, but the tense kind, the kind where people try not to be noticed. And it's here, in the hush, that you realize something odd. No one talks about married women. They're everywhere, obviously. You've passed them hauling baskets, scolding toddlers, nursing infants, and bargaining over dried fish. But the moment they get married, something peculiar happens. Legally, they disappear. Welcome to the strange world of coverture, where marrying a man meant becoming one with him in the eyes of the land by one. They mostly meant him. You, the wife, were no longer considered a separate legal person. You couldn't own property. You couldn't sue anyone. You couldn't even make a will without your husband's consent. In theory, you were absorbed into him like wine into stew. Romantic, right? But here's the fun twist. Despite this medieval legal vanishing act, women still found ways to act. They signed contracts through clever loopholes, conducted business using proxies, and leaned heavily on the one document that could briefly turn everything around, the dower agreement. You find yourself outside, a modest stone house with a wooden sign above the door, a simple key carved into it. This is the home of a locksmith and his wife, though her name won't be on any paperwork. She's inside now, negotiating the price of a custom order, while her husband is off getting drunk. With the miller, she speaks in measured tones, glances at the customer's shoes to gauge status, and casually tucks the coin into a pouch she later claims she never saw. Technically, she's not allowed to manage the business. Practically, she runs it. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage laws actively repressed women or merely reflected broader social norms. Was it oppression, or just standard-issue patriarchy with extra rules? The answer, like a poorly translated Latin contract, is murky at best. Let's wander a little further. Down a narrow path, you spot a small group gathered beneath a tree. A dispute is unfolding, a property boundary disagreement involving two neighbors and a very smug-looking chicken. The local reeve listens patiently. Then, a widow steps forward, voice calm, gaze steady. She presents a parchment, a deed, signed years ago, witnessed by 3 people still alive. She may not have the brawn, but she's got something better. Receipts, see. Once a woman's husband died, something magical happened. She became legally visible again. Widows could own property, sue for damages, lend money, and draft their own wills. Some were richer than ever, especially if they'd buried more than one spouse. It's a bit morbid, but in medieval Europe, the most legally empowered woman was often the one whose husband had finally stopped talking. Of course, life didn't suddenly become easy. These women had to fight for every Inchugan's family, members trying to cheat them, priests advising them to remarry for their soul's sake, and neighbors who resented a woman bold enough to say no. Still, some thrived. There's record of a widow in York who ran an international import business from her home, buying and selling spices, fabrics, and the occasional barrel of very suspicious wine. Her name was Marjorie, too. Medieval England had about 1,000 Marjories. You pause outside a courthouse. It's not grand, just a half-timbered hall with muddy footprints on the threshold, but it's where decisions get made. Inside, a woman stands at the edge of the chamber, stiff-backed and calm. She's representing herself in a case about an unpaid dowry. Her Latin is broken, but her resolve isn't. She points out dates, names, details no one else remembers. She wins, quietly. The scribes barely notice. They probably didn't even record her name. Meanwhile, outside the legal system, women played another kind of game, social maneuvering. You catch a conversation between 2 wives in a garden. One is warning the other that a certain priest has been visiting a certain widow too often. Not out of jealousy, out of strategy. If the priest takes a fancy, the widow's influence might grow, and that shifts the whole balance of neighborhood politics. The church may run heaven, but down here, it's alliances and veiled threats that really move the wheel. You slip into a shop where a wife is making an embroidery sale. As she counts coins, you notice she's also watching her apprentice out of the corner of her eye. That girl's needlework is too good. The wife smiles, but her jaw tightens. She knows what's coming soon. The girl will strike out on her own, maybe open a rival shop. So tonight, the wife will speak kindly, offer advice, and maybe swap out one good dye for a slightly faded one, just in case. There's a reason legal scholars refer to medieval women's agency as limited but tactical. They worked within systems that didn't officially acknowledge them, shaping outcomes behind the scenes. They mastered the art of influence by suggestion. If their husband signed the document, they chose the ink. If they couldn't testify, they coached the neighbor who could. You pass a house with music drifting through the open window. Someone inside is singing while mending a hem. Her voice is soft and lone, a performance, just a habit. Maybe it's the only moment of self-expression she'll get all day. Or maybe she sings because the hem is for someone she loves. You never know with songs as night returns. You circle back to the locksmith's home. The wife is sitting now, feet up, sipping a cup of something herbal and probably stronger than she admits. Her daughter braids a bit of leftover cord into a bracelet. The fire pops. No one here looks powerful, but they've negotiated and quietly rewritten the rules all day. They've lost battles, yes, but they've also won small wars that history won't bother to mention. The stars are out. A dog barks somewhere. A shutter slams in the distance. Another day ends and the record books will say very little about what these women did. But you saw it. You walked their streets. You learned their names, even the ones they weren't allowed to sign. Your feet take you away from the crowded homes and legal half-lives of marriage, past a weathered fence where herbs climb over each other like nosy neighbors. The air here shifts less wood smoke, more lavender, mint, and something unfamiliar but sharp. You've entered the world of women who knew things they weren't supposed to. And often, those things had roots. A cottage squats at the edge of the woods. Not ominous, not sinister dash, just ... Quiet. There's a basket by the door, and a broom, leaning against the wall. Inside, a fire crackles, and two women crouch over a wooden table littered with dried leaves, small bones, and hand-carved spoons. One is older, with hands like tree bark and eyes that scan everything. The other is younger, listening, measuring, learning. You've found the midwife. In medieval towns and villages, midwives were both revered and feared. They were called in at life's most vulnerable moments: birth, sickness, death, and they often knew more about the human body than the town priest or even the local physician, which wasn't hard, considering physicians often prescribed gold leaf and pigeon dung while charging 5 chickens and a miracle. You watch as the elder midwife mixes a brew of tansy, pennyroyal, and mugwort. The scent rises like a challenge. "It's for women's troubles," she says. That vague, slippery phrase used to describe anything from irregular periods to unwanted pregnancies. Officially, this was healing. Unofficially, it danced right on the edge of church doctrine. Historians still argue whether midwives practiced medicine or magic. The line was blurry even then. A woman who helped a breech birth one week could be praised as an angel, and accused of witchcraft the next if something went wrong. It didn't help that they used chants, charms, and salves that came with whispered instructions and unpronounceable ingredients. You follow them to a birth silent, respectful, unnoticed. The mother's moaning is rhythmic, the pain wrapped in swaddling cloths of prayer and sweat. The midwife hums a tune under her breath while checking the pulse at the woman's neck. The younger assistant fetches warm water and something that smells like cloves. There are no men here. This space is sacred and terrifying and entirely feminine. When the baby arrives, red, slippery, furious, it's wrapped and inspected with the same gravity you might give a new moon. 10 fingers, 10 toes, good lungs, a nod, relief. But there's always a risk, always a shadow. The mother is pale, the bleeding heavy. The older midwife acts quickly, pressing herbs against her skin, whispering something that sounds like half a lullaby, half a spell. In the corner, a child peeks through the doorframe. She's maybe 5, watching, learning. In 20 years, she'd be the one reaching for mugwort, calming a cousin, telling her that the pain is normal, that the blood is part of the story. And so the knowledge passes down not through textbooks or formal training, but through repetition and ritual. Through doing. You walk through a grove behind the cottage, where plants grow in neat chaos. Angelica, sage, comfrey, foxglove. Some heal, some harm. Some do both, depending on how you prepare them. A hanging bundle of wolfsbane dries on a crooked beam. You make a mental note not to touch that one. Here's a quirky detail. Some midwives carried tiny wax figurines in their aprons. They weren't dolls, exactly, more like talismans. Symbols to calm the mother, distract the child, or invoke protection. Church officials were suspicious. Naturally, anything symbolic that wasn't pre-approved was immediately suspect. But, to the women who used them, they were just part of the kit, like a birthing stool or a good grip. You stop at a wooden shelf filled with labeled jars, ashes, crushed shells, rose petals, dried berries, snakeskin probably fake, and a mysterious, dark powder with no label. You feel like you're in a medieval apothecary designed by someone with both a practical need for healing and a slightly chaotic spiritual streak. The younger woman, Ellen, let's call her, asks about the uses of bones. Her mentor replies, without blinking, protection, clarity, sometimes fertility. Depends on the bone. You're not sure if she's joking. Probably not. Back in the village, someone stumbles into the square, calling for help. A child has fallen from a tree. The midwife and her assistant move faster than you'd expect for women in layers of linen and wool. They kneel beside the boy, assess the swelling, and mutter about willow bark and resting joints. A priest arrives and starts suggesting prayer. The midwife nods politely while crushing a leaf in her palm. One is for the soul, the other for the swelling. She's not trying to replace religion. She just knows that willow bark works, and that sometimes, when God is busy, you need someone who's been elbow deep in blood and still knows what root to boil. You notice the tension when she walks away. Some villagers nod in gratitude, others look sideways, whisper, "It's that eternal, medieval question. Is she a healer, or is she meddling with things she shouldn't?" The answer changes depending on whether your baby survived, and yet, when dusk falls and the wind shifts, it's her doorstep they come to. The ones with fevers, with questions they can't ask publicly, with aches they don't understand. Sometimes they bring chickens, sometimes they just bring tears. She opens the door every time. That night, the fire in her cottage burns late. She's mixing another tincture. Ellen writes something down, just a few words, maybe a symbol. A recipe for pain relief, or for protection, or just for remembrance. These notes may never become formal medicine, but they'll survive in whispered instructions and half-remembered songs. And when they're found, centuries later, scribbled in a margin, or buried beside a wooden comb, historians will argue whether these were signs of science or sorcery. You'll know the answer. It was both. You leave the midwife's cottage behind, the scent of dried herbs still clinging to your cloak, and follow the faint sound of bells chiming through the streets. They aren't cathedral bells this time. They're smaller, brighter, and a little offbeat, not solemn. Curious. You round a corner, and there it is, a schoolhouse. Not quite a building, really a room, tucked behind the sacristy, with benches too small for adults, and slates worn down to dusty ghosts. Inside, a group of children recites their Latin phrases. Most are boys, sleeves rolled up, scratching at their writing boards with stubby bits of chalk. But there, in the back row, sits a girl. She's holding her slate sideways and smirking slightly. Her name might be Cecily, or Joan, something strong and unbending. You sit beside her as she carefully writes the word Sapintia, wisdom. Here's the twist. Education for girls in the Middle Ages was rare, but not non-existent, depending on the time, place, and the wealth of her family. A girl could be taught to read and write, usually in Latin, sometimes in French, occasionally in the local dialect, and always with a heavy dose of religious instruction. Officially, it was so she could pray properly. Unofficially, it let her outwit 3 of her future husbands. Cecily nudges you and points to a poem she's scribbled between lessons. It's about a dog, or a priest, or maybe both. It's short, sharp, and rude. You laugh quietly. She grins, wider. The monk overseeing the class is old and mostly deaf, which helps. In wealthier homes, noble girls were often taught music, embroidery, and moral philosophy, whatever that means. When you're 12 and already betrothed, some even had private tutors. One famous abbess, Hildegard of Bingen, wrote music, theological treatises, and medical texts in Latin. But she started as a girl with migraines and a strong pen. Historians still argue whether she was uniquely brilliant or simply the one who had the means to write it all down. But it's not just noble girls. You follow Cecily home after lessons, down muddier paths, to a modest house where she helps her mother bake bread. That's where the second school begins, one of mothers and sisters and aunts. Here, girls learn how to budget, how to settle disputes without raising their voices, and how to tell if a man's flattery is genuine or just another way to get out of chores. It's less Euclid's geometry and more advanced passive aggression. 101. You peek into the corner of the house where a little book rests. Not a Bible, something else. A bestiary maybe, or a loose collection of translated tales choser. Light. Cecily reads it when no one's watching, her lips forming each word with reverence and delight. She knows this is borrowed time. Soon she'll be married, or apprenticed, or both. So she soaks in every phrase, as if knowledge could be stored. Like grain, in another home across town, a group of older girls gathers in what looks like a sewing circle. But there are books nearby, hidden under the fabric. One of them is reading aloud slowly, deliberately from a saint's life. Then, she switches suddenly to a romance. Gasps and giggles follow. You blink. Was that, ... an innuendo? One girl stifles a laugh and says, "We should stop before the Virgin Mary hears us." The others nod, solemn-faced, but eyes twinkling. This is how learning works. Here not just from books, but from listening, copying, adapting, smuggling stories. Inside, stories like contraband. You notice one girl sketching something in chalk on the floor shapes, angles, patterns. She's probably the daughter of a merchant. Numbers matter when you're calculating cloth, coins, or dowries. Her brothers are being trained for business. She's expected to marry someone who handles ledgers. But she knows how the ledgers work. The role of numeracy among medieval women is often overlooked. But evidence suggests many were skilled in arithmetic, especially those managing estates or shops. A widow running a tavern didn't just pour ale. She tracked expenses, priced goods, managed staff, and haggled with suppliers. Sure, she might do it all in her head, but that doesn't make it less of a calculation. You pass a small chest tucked under a bed, locked. Inside letters. Some copied, some original, all written in that rounded, careful hand that suggests a woman afraid of being corrected. These letters are 2 husbands, 2 daughters in convents, 2 merchants, 2 lost lovers. Each one a little miracle, thought turned into ink turned into memory. In an age where parchment was precious and literacy rare, a letter was a luck, a risk, and then there were codes. Not official ones, but private languages between women. Shared symbols in embroidery, rhymes that taught when to plant and when to hide. A circle of dots could mean danger. A flower with 5 petals might recall a prayer or a secret pact. Historians debate whether these codes were truly systematic or just coincidence. You've seen enough to know better. Back on the street, you see a boy teasing a girl about her reading. She stares at him and recites a line from Augustine. That goes over his head. Then she walks away. You wish she'd drop the mic, but medieval girls didn't carry mics. Just opinions sharp enough to slice cheese. There's one final place you stop today, a merchant's house. The daughter here has everything: access to books, tutors, and no pressure to marry, quite yet. She's fluent in 3 languages, writes with a steady hand. and has recently decided to translate an old pagan poem into French. Her father disapproves, but softly. Her mother encourages it. Her brother pretends not to notice she's smarter than him. She shrugs and keeps writing. And that's the thing. Medieval education for women was patchy, improvised, unequal but never absent. Girls carved out knowledge wherever they could, whether in schoolrooms, kitchens, gardens, or dreams. They learned from each other, from mistakes, from stories, from silence as night falls again. You sit beside Cecily, who's scratching her name into the underside of her wooden slate. She knows it won't last, but for a moment her name exists. Her voice echoes in a room full of boys. Her thoughts take shape, and that's more than history ever promised her. The town settles into a hushed murmur as the stars climb overhead, and you wander toward the edges, the bits people don't talk about during feasts or sermons. Down here, where the roads get dustier and the homes more crowded, another kind of work waits. You hesitate at first, but curiosity is a louder voice than modesty. And let's be honest too, come this far. It's time to meet the women who didn't spin wool or pour ale, but who still knew the power of a good story, a softer voice, or the right smile at the wrong time. She's standing in the doorway of a narrow building with peeling paint and no sign. Her gown is bright, too bright, as if defying the soot-colored world around her. The kohl around her eyes is slightly smudged. She looks at you without flinching. That's how you know she's been watched her whole life. This is the domain of the medieval sex worker, also called camp follower, single woman. Or if the clerk was feeling particularly moral, woman of ill repute. Whatever the name, her story was always written by someone else. You step inside the dim room where low voices curl like smoke. It's not all scandal and seduction. Mostly it's practical. A girl plats another's hair. A woman counts coins. Someone hums off-key. There's talk of sore feet, bad stew, and a soldier who forgot to pay. It's a workplace. Just one wrapped in shame, survival, and a rotating cast of double standards. The line between service and sign is a blurry one, especially in medieval cities. Brothels were often licensed by town officials. Yes, really, because it was better, they thought, to contain the vice than have it spilling all over the place. Some brothels were church-owned. Pause and let that settle. Historians still argue whether this system protected women or exploited them further. Was regulation a form of control, or a reluctant acknowledgement that sex work was simply part of urban life? Either way, it happened, often. And behind every city ordinance or priestly sermon was a woman just trying to stay fed. You watch as one of them, Letta, applies a tincture to a bruised arm. Another woman winces and mutters something that might be a curse or a joke. They laugh anyway. Letta rolls her eyes, dabs again, and says she'll be charging double next time if the customer has calloused hands. It's said like a threat, but you hear the exhaustion in it too. These women weren't just selling sex. They were reading people for survival. They learned how to spot danger in a smile, to steer conversations, to protect the younger girls without making it obvious. Lita, for example, knows who's new in town, who's drunk too often, and which priest tips in silence. The worst clients, she says, are the ones who think they're rescuing you. The ones who bring flowers and promises like this is a tragedy and not an economy. She once knew a girl who believed a knight's vow. He gave her a necklace and disappeared before the frost. They buried her the next spring. Cold took her faster than heartbreak. But not all the stories end like that. One woman here now owns the place technically in her brother's name, but she holds the key. She's clever, keeps a ledger, and pays bribes to 3 different men who pretend not to notice her. She reads French novels when no one's looking. She's rewriting her life, quietly, in footnotes. You pass a room where a woman is sewing by candlelight. She's working on her own dress, not for a client. The thread is dark red. She hums an old tune, something from her childhood maybe. Her name isn't recorded anywhere. No records, no marriage, no baptismal note, but her stitches are steady, and tonight, that's enough. Out on the balcony, 2 girls lean on the railing, watching the moon rise. One's talking about leaving, not soon, but someday. The other just nods. She's heard it before. Sometimes. Women did leave. They joined convents, married old clients, opened bakeries, or vanished into other towns. Sometimes they didn't. But every woman here has a someday stored in her heart. Like a folded note. Here's a strange historical tidbit. In some towns, sex workers were required by law to wear specific colors or stripes. It was supposed to shame them. But guess what? The fashion caught on. Striped skirts became trendy. So much for public humiliation. There's always resistance hidden in the seams. Like the girl who prays before bed not to be forgiven, but to be safe. Or the one who keeps a tally of every insult she hears, carved lightly into her floorboard like notches on a sword, not hatefully, just as proof that she survived them all. Before you leave, you notice a painted box on a shelf. Inside are coins, bits of ribbon, a comb with a missing tooth, and a small scrap of parchment with a line of poetry. You recognize the handwriting. It's from that girl at the school. Maybe it was passed here in secret. Maybe it's just copied from memory. Either way, it means someone remembered her. That matters. You step out into the cool night air. The door closes behind you without a sound. The women inside return to their stories, their laughter, their calculations. In a world that called them nameless, they gave each other names. And while the historians debate morality, structure, and sin, you know what you saw: resilience wrapped in rouge and silk. 1,000 quiet rebellions behind smudged coal and knowing. Eyes you keep walking, past torchlight and whispers. The street curves back toward town, but your thoughts linger behind, where the rules were bent. The voice is soft, and the dignity fierce. You follow the river now, the water catching moonlight like spilled silver. The road hugs the banks, quieter than before, lined with fields and low fences. It's the kind of stretch you'd expect to find empty at this hour. But then you hear the soft shuffle of feet, the creak of a yoke, and the low murmur of women talking as they carry bundles and baskets home through the dark. These are the peasant women, the true labor force of the medieval world, not in castles or convents, but ankle-deep in mud, elbow-deep in grain, and always half a step behind the next job. You think of them as background characters, maybe. Simple, poor, faceless. But stay a while, and you'll see just how complicated, skilled, and wildly underappreciated their lives really were. One woman you pass is carrying firewood that reaches over her head. It sways with each step, but she moves like she's done this 1,000 times. She has. She doesn't look up when you pass. She's got to get home before the stew burns, or the baby wakes. Or her husband notices she took the good kindling. Her name's probably Alice, or Maud, or something old and sharp like a flint tool. Her hands are cracked, her back permanently bent, and her memory holds more weather data than any monastery chronicle ever recorded. Historians still argue whether peasant women were resilient survivors or abused workhorses. The truth is, they were both, and neither. They were everything: laborers, mothers, weavers, healers, storytellers, taxpayers, cheesemakers, and sometimes entirely invisible to the people writing the records. Alice drops her firewood outside, a squat timber house, and ducks inside. You follow, unseen. There's a baby on the floor, chewing on a scrap of cloth. A pot bubbles. Someone snores in the corner. She grabs a ladle, stirs, tastes, sighs. Not enough salt, but it'll do. Dinner isn't a meal, it's a negotiation. What do we have? What do we hide? What will last till Sunday? You glance around the cottage. Sparse, yes, but organized. The hearth is the heart, flanked by a storage chest and bundles of herbs hanging. From the rafters, there's a makeshift cradle next to the hearth, and above it, a wooden spoon carved with vines. A gift, a ward. Hard to say. Medieval peasant women often slipped symbols into their tools. Hearts, moons, crosses not just for decoration, but as quiet prayers against hunger, cold, and plague. There's a fringe belief still whispered in corners of academia that many peasant households followed hybrid spiritual traditions, blending Christian rites with old folk customs passed down like family recipes. It was practical magic. Sweep the doorstep with rosemary, spit on the first egg of spring, tie a red thread to your sleeve when the baby teeth come in. You weren't trying to rebel. You were just trying to survive. Tomorrow, Alice will rise before the sun. She'll tend to livestock, weed the garden, carry water, and hope the grain store hasn't been raided by rats again. Her husband might go to the Lord's field to fulfill his labor duties, or maybe he's already drunk in the neighbor's barn. Either way, the house keeps spinning, and she's the one pushing it. You follow her again, this time out to the commons. A group of women is gathered in a ring, beating laundry against smooth stones in the river. The rhythm is hypnotic. Slap, twist, rinse, slap, twist, gossip. Someone's cousin was seen kissing the Reeves' son. Someone else's sheep is suspiciously plump. You'd think this was just chatter, but it's also where information flows. The laundry circle is medieval LinkedIn. They talk about prices, weather, taxes, love, and livestock. They warn each other about men who hit too hard, about illnesses creeping through the town, about which priest looks the other way when you skip Mass. It's not idle talk, it's intelligence, shared with soapy hands and raised eyebrows. One woman, older, dips her rag into a pail of lye and mutters a joke that makes half the circle snort. You catch the gist. It's about a bishop, a goat, and a misread scripture. You don't need the details. The laughter is the point. Even here, even now, there's room for joy. Nearby, a child tugs at her mother's skirt. The woman squats, flicks the soap from her hands, and starts singing. It's a lullaby, but also a weather rhyme, and possibly a veiled insult aimed at her sister-in-law. It's hard to tell. Medieval songs carried layered meanings, shaped to the moment. And women carried those songs, like tools, passing them down, tweaking them, adding verses when needed. You watch as they wring out the cloth, stretch it on bushes to dry, and begin packing up. They move like birds, all sudden energy and instinct. A cart passes by, and one woman hitches a ride, lifting herself up with the grace of someone who's been climbing wagons since before she could spell her name. Back in town, the evening meal begins. Bread, cheese, root, vegetables, a scrap of meat, if they're lucky. The fire burns low. A child dozes off with a crust still clutched in one hand. Alice leans against the wall, eyes half shut, and listens to the wind scratch at the shutters. She won't rest long. There's spinning to do, and then maybe patching a cloak, or prepping tomorrow's grain. The work never stops, but neither does she. And here's the wild thing: most medieval texts don't mention women like Alice. You'll find the names of queens and nuns, the occasional merchant's wife, the noble who built a chapel, but the women who tilled the fields, who birthed the babies, who buried their children in unmarked graves, and got up the next day to bake bread, those women are ghosts in the margins. But tonight, you've walked beside them. You've heard their laughter, their warnings, their lullabies. You've seen how they lived, how they endured, how they passed on everything they knew without fanfare or credit. And maybe that's the real secret history. The quiet persistence of ordinary women who never made it into the records but held up the world anyway. Your steps lead away from the muddy fields and fire smoke of peasant homes, and toward something, colder. The air sharpens as you climb a worn path winding toward a stone manor perched just above the village. The torchlight here doesn't flicker, like it does in the cottages, stands straighter, brighter, and more deliberate. You're entering the domain of noble women, silks instead of wool, saffron instead of onions. But don't let the embroidery fool your life. Here was no soft poem. You slip past the gates, unnoticed. The manor isn't a palace, not quite. Think fewer chandeliers, more drafty corridors, and tapestries, doing their best to keep out the cold. A maid hurries past, arms full of linen. Behind her, a young woman tall, deliberate paces a gallery. She's reading a letter by candlelight, her fingers twitching at the edge like she wants to tear it in two. Her name, let's call her Isolde. It fits. Lady Isolde is about 17 and already betrothed. She didn't choose the man, of course. Her father did, while calculating land holdings and titles like ingredients in a stew. But Isolde knows the math too. She's read her family's account books, and she knows that love, here, is less about hearts and more about borders. Noble marriages were political strategies. Women like Isolde were pawns, yes, but also messengers, mediators, and occasionally saboteurs. A poorly timed flirtation could collapse a truce. A whispered warning could save a brother. These women were not passive, they were playing the game. With the pieces they were given. Inside the hall, servants light candles for the evening meal. The smells are unfamiliar meat, with strange spices, a sauce too sweet. Isolde's mother sits at the head of the table, cool as stone, commenting on her daughter's posture in between bites of salted fish. This woman runs the household staff. Stores, etiquette, hospitality. She's the medieval version of an operations manager, a state accountant, and PR officer rolled into one, and no one gives her enough credit. Historians still argue whether noble women had true power, or just ceremonial influence. The answer: look at the receipts. Many women controlled vast dower lands after widowhood, negotiated alliances, and even mustered troops. Eleanor of Aquitaine led armies. Margaret Paston wrote reams of letters that historians now use to understand half the century. They weren't just decorative, they were decisive. Isolde's mother excuses herself to supervise. The steward, and Isolde, takes her chance. She rushes to Isolde her private chamber, small but blessedly warm, and opens a chest. Inside, letters, poems, small carved tokens, a piece of silk embroidered with her own initials, a secret life in fragments. She reads one note again, tracing the ink with her fingertip. The handwriting is careful, probably a clerk. The words, though, they belong to someone who knows her mind. This isn't just a romance, it's strategy, emotional chess. If she chooses wisely, at least not foolishly, she might survive marriage with dignity. If not, ... well, there are ways to endure. Even noble women knew how to fake illness, hide letters, and manipulate dowry terms. You do what you must, especially when your wedding is more like a military alliance with better table settings. In another chamber, a lady-in-waiting teaches embroidery. The other girls stitch flowers and saints with dainty hands and far-off eyes. But one girl, a redhead, with a sharp tongue, is using gold thread to outline a falcon catching a hare. You don't need a translator to know that's a metaphor. She says nothing, just smiles. Lady Isolde joins them, laughing a little too loud, asking about silk dyes and wedding colors. This is how she prepares. Not by rebelling, she's not stupid, but by learning how to charm, misdirect, and remember who said what after their third cup of wine. You follow her later to the chapel. She kneels, whispers a prayer, and then stays silent. Long after the priest leaves, her face doesn't move, but you sense the tension. Is she praying for escape? For courage? For revenge? You never find out. But when she rises, her spine is straighter. That night, a banquet begins. Minstrels play. Platters arrive. Peacocks, almond paste, a stew thick, enough to drown a rat. The men talk politics. The women listen except for the dowager aunt, who occasionally leans in with commentary sharp enough to draw blood. Isolde sits beside her, betrothed. He has nice teeth, and absolutely no idea she plans to delay the wedding by invoking a clause about lunar cycles and fertility timing. It's in the small print. Across the hall, her mother eyes her carefully, then nods once, approval, or at least, recognition. They understand each other. You don't survive in this world by playing fair. You survive by knowing which battles matter, and which ones can be won in silence. Here's a quirky bit. Some noble women commissioned their own books, not just religious texts, but romances, histories, even medical treatises. Marjorie Kemp wrote what's considered the first English-language autobiography. It's chaotic, emotional, and sometimes wildly unreliable. Just like life. And that's what makes it so perfect. Later in her bedchamber, Isolde writes a journal entry, maybe, or another secret letter. She uses a tiny bit of wax to seal it and hides it behind a tapestry. You wonder if it'll be found centuries from now, read aloud in a museum by someone trying to guess what her life was like. You already know. As you step out of the manor, the wind picks up. The stars are colder here, sharper. The village below glows faintly, and you think of Alice by the hearth, Letta at her ledger, Cecily tracing words on a slate, and here, high on the hill, Lady Isolde, dressed in silk and steel. She may walk with grace, but her shoes are lined with thorns. Every step is measured, every smile rehearsed, and every breath is a victory. The manor fades behind you, its high walls and candlelit windows shrinking into the dark, as you make your way into the forest that creeps beyond the edge of noble land. The trees here are old, gnarled, and unusually quiet. You feel like you've crossed into another world, one that doesn't quite answer to church bells or tax collectors. And maybe you have, because deep in this wood, hidden from road and register, lives the kind of woman medieval townsfolk only spoke of in whispers. They call her a wise woman, or a witch, or a saint. Sometimes all three. But her name, her real name, is lost under centuries of soot and storytelling. You follow a trail of crushed leaves and rabbit bones until you reach a hut made from wattle and daub, barely tall enough to stand inside. Smoke curls from a thatch roof. Something hangs drying from a wooden beam, herbs maybe, or charms, or something watching you back. Inside, the woman, wrinkled as bark and twice as observant, sits grinding something in a mortar. She doesn't flinch when you arrive. She probably knew you were coming. She knows when anyone's coming. She's the one people visit in secret, usually after dark. Usually when there's no hope left. There's a child sleeping in a corner, wrapped in a wool cloak. A mother sits beside her, eyes wide, face pinched. The child has a fever. The local priest says to pray. The barber surgeon offered to bleed her. This woman, however, is stirring something bitter-smelling and humming under her breath. She adds, dried roots, a scrap of fabric, a thumbprint of honey. The result is ugly, pungent, and possibly effective. This kind of healing folk medicine, sympathetic magic, old wives' remedies, was the domain of women who straddled the line between tolerated and persecuted. And while modern scholars debate whether they were scientists, mystics, or something in between, one thing is certain. People kept coming to them. Desperation doesn't care about dogma. You sit on a low stool and watch as she mixes poultices, reads signs and tea leaves, and mutters things in a dialect even the nearby village has forgotten. Her fingers move with practiced precision. Her eyes never blink. Somewhere in her hut is a dried frog, 3 bundles of nettle, and a vial labeled with a symbol that might be a rune, or a joke. There's something undeniably theatrical about it. All, but underneath, the performance is deep, generational knowledge. She knows which route dulls pain, which leaf halts bleeding, and which flower might bring sleep or stop a pregnancy. And while the monks copy Latin treatises, they barely understand. This woman records her data in memory, gesture, and the occasional knot in a string. Of course, this kind of knowledge makes people nervous. Church authorities tolerated it when it stayed useful. But if the harvest failed, or a child died, or a priest's dog went missing, guess who got blamed? Historians still argue whether witch trials were a gendered purge, or just convenient scapegoating. Either way, it's no coincidence that most of the accused were women, and many of them lived just like this, alone, skilled, and surrounded by stories no one else could quite explain. You glance at the sleeping child again. She's sweating, but less now. Her mother breathes a little easier. The old woman gives her a sachet to hang above the door, plus firm instructions not to speak. Of this visit, she takes a loaf of bread. In exchange, no coin. It's not about profit. It's about balance. As they leave, another figure enters. A man, this time limping. He says nothing, just shows a deep wound, blackened at the edges. She frowns, nods, and begins mixing something new. You wonder how many people survive because she exists, and how few are willing to say her name in daylight. On one wall of the hut hangs a wooden disc painted with symbols. It's a calendar of sword-striking moons, tides, feast days, and things that shouldn't be written down. A reminder that medieval timekeeping wasn't just about saints and harvests. It was about rhythm, nature, the kind of knowledge passed through generations of women. Mostly orally, mostly while doing other things like spinning, or weaving, or baking bread. In a leather pouch beside the hearth. you find scraps of parchment, drawings of plants, lists of symptoms, a crude map of stars. There's a line scrawled in the margin that reads, "When the crow flies north before snow, the child will live." You don't know if it's science, superstition, or something else entirely, but you feel the weight of it anyway. The woman finally speaks to you, not in words, but in gesture. She points to the fire, then to a pot simmering over it. Inside is a thick, green brew. You sniff. It smells like hope. Or hallucination. Hard to tell. She offers you a sip. You decline politely. Later, you sit outside her hut as night deepens. Somewhere far off, wolves howl. Or maybe that's just the wind teasing your ears. The sky is ink dark, and the stars blink like they're keeping secrets. You think of all the things medieval history never bothers to explain: mystical illnesses, sudden recoveries, curses, blessings, saints who bled and didn't die. And somewhere in that mess, this woman fits. Not a villain, not a savior, just someone who learned how to listen to the earth before anyone wrote it down. Before you leave, she presses something into your hand. A small Tokana carved bead, or a dried seed pod, or maybe just a polished stone. No explanation, but she expects you to keep it, and you do. Because whether she was healer, witch, or wise woman, she was part of the great, unrecorded machinery of medieval life. She didn't ask permission. She just did the work. You step out of the woods and back into the world of bells and breadlines. Past the baker's shop where someone's already setting out tomorrow's dough to rise. The scent clings to your clothes, flour and smoke and something faintly sweet. The streets are quiet now, the lamps guttering low. But you follow the thread of movement that never really stops. A procession of women. Slow, cloaked hands, tucked deep into sleeves. They head toward a low stone building, modest from the outside, but glowing within. A convent. You slip inside with them, passing under an archway, carved with Latin you vaguely recognize. The air shifts. It's still heavy with wax and silence. Someone is singing far off. Just one voice, clear as a bell dropped in water. Welcome to the monastery's other half. The nunnery. Inside the cloister, the world changes tempo. The rush of trade, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of carts, it all fades. Here, the days run by a different rhythm. Hours of prayer, of song, of quiet work. For many medieval women, this wasn't exile, it was sanctuary. A place to think, to write, to live outside the chokehold of marriage and childbirth. But let's not romanticize it too much. Becoming a nun wasn't always a spiritual epiphany. Sometimes it was a last resort. Sometimes it was the safest path. Sometimes it was simply what happened when your father had too many daughters and not enough dowries. You'll be married to Christ, they said, and that was supposed to feel better than being sold to a minor baron with a limp and a temper. You follow Sister Agnes, who's maybe 30, though time is blurry in here. She moves with purpose. Through the scriptorium, a long room filled with scratchy sounds and sharp smells, parchment, ink, oil lamps. She's copying a text by hand, her letters neat and deliberate, illuminated with red flourishes. The book is about saints. It's also about illness, hunger, war, and divine mystery. It's not light reading. Sister Agnes was once a merchant's daughter. She wanted to travel, to study, to write poetry. So, naturally, she was betrothed at 15 to a man she'd never met. He died of a sudden fever before the wedding. Some might call that tragic. She called it deliverance. She came here 2 winters later, shaved her head, learned Latin, and started copying the lives of martyrs. She also writes her own verses in the margins when no one's looking. One of them rhymes virtue with turnip, and you love her for that. Historians still argue whether convents were places of liberation or containment. Were nuns free to think and learn, or were they just tucked out of sight, conveniently off the marriage market? The answer depends on the nun, the abbess, and the time period. Some wrote treatises, others embroidered cushions. Some ruled abbeys like CEOs. Others barely made it through morning prayers without rolling their eyes. You wander the herb garden, rows of rosemary, rue fennel, and violets. 2 sisters are pruning with quiet focus, their habits smeared with green. They know the properties of every plant, which calms the stomach, which draws out fever, which brings on bleeding. A young novice recites a list of symptoms as she works. This isn't just gardening. This is medicine, practiced in whispers and soft footsteps. Inside, the infirmary smells of vinegar and old wood. A woman lies on a straw-stuffed mattress, wrapped tight in linen. Her breaths are shallow. A nun sits beside her, wiping her brow with gentian-scented water. Another writes something in a small book, symptoms, perhaps, or a prayer, or both. Here, science and spirit mingle. You could call it superstition, or you could admit it works sometimes better than bleeding with leeches. You step into the chapel as evening bells begin. The sisters file in, heads bowed, voices raised, and chant. It's hypnotically written in slow motion. You lose track of the words. Maybe they're about God, maybe about grief. Either way, they fill the air like warm fog, pulling you deeper into something ancient and oddly soothing. And there are stories here, even if most don't survive beyond a name in a monastery ledger, like the sister who once smuggled bread to plague victims and lost her hands to frostbite, or the one who lit the fire each night for 40 years, never missing a single Vespers bell, or the abbess who rewrote a banned text using metaphors about sheep and embroidery so cleverly that even the bishop couldn't object. One nun, old, small, nearly translucent, carries the key to the library. She walks slowly, but you sense power in her fingers. She unlocks the door and lets you peek. Inside, scrolls, hymnals, bestiaries, letters, and one very worn copy of Boethius. There's also a loose translation of Virgil, hidden behind a psalter. Curious. Here's a quirky little gem. In some convents, the nuns had their own sign language. Since they took vows of silence during certain hours, they developed gestures to indicate food, prayer, laughter, or annoyance. A flick of the wrist could mean bring wine, or Sister Benedict is snoring again. They invented their own way to speak when speech was forbidden. You have to admire that. You sit for a while in the cloister walk, watching shadows stretch along the flagstones. A group of young novices passes, one of them giggling, clearly trying not to. The others shush her, but not too harshly. Even here, in all this solemnity, there's room for a little chaos. Before you leave, you watch Sister Agnes close her book. She dots the last I with an ink-smeared finger, then lifts the candle to admire her work. It's beautiful. Not perfect, but precise. She spent hours on these pages. No one outside these walls may ever read them, but she wrote them anyway. That's the quiet miracle of the medieval convent. Not the prayers, not the rituals, not even the saintly relics behind glass. It's the stubborn act of recording, of remembering, of refusing to disappear. And as you slip out into the chill of night, you carry with you the echo of that chant, the scent of rosemary, and the silent certainty that somewhere, in some forgotten cloister, a woman is still writing. By now, the night feels longer than it should. You've drifted from hearth to hall, from convent to cottage, collecting the unseen lives of medieval women, like glowing coals in your hand. But there's one more kind of story waiting for you to trace, less tidy than the songs or prayers, and usually scribbled in the margins of history's cleaner pages. You step into a crowded street, not bustling with people, but with evidence of them, shutters left open, carts left half-loaded, a spindle leaning against a wall where someone got distracted. The noise you hear is coming from further up, past the market stalls and guild halls, toward the town square. There, in the firelit shadow of a stone platform, stands a woman with a voice sharp enough to split silence. She's speaking not politely, not demurely, but boldly, rhythmically, like someone used to being heard and punished for it. Her name is lost to time, of course. Let's call her Margot. It suits her. Margot is part of a small crowd. Not quite a mob, but close. She's shouting about rent, about bread, about laws made by men in boots who've never carried water a day in their lives. Her accent is rough, her words sharper than the cobblestones underfoot. The men around her shift uneasily. The women, they nod, tight-lipped, familiar with fury. This is protest. Not formal, not recorded in any noble diary, but it's real. And women like Margot have always been part of it, shouting, striking, refusing, surviving. From the grain riots in 14th century France, to the spinning women who stopped markets when prices rose too high, women fought. Not always with swords. Sometimes with spoons and songs and burned loaves. Historians still argue whether these actions were political, or just emotional outbursts. But when you have 5 children, and no flour, rage is a political strategy. You watch as Margot gets pulled from the platform by a constable. Her feet drag, but her mouth doesn't stop moving. She's fined, maybe jailed, maybe worse. But tomorrow, someone else will take her place. The system can ignore women, but it cannot quiet them forever. Not all defiance was loud, though. In quieter corners, resistance took subtler forms. A widow who refuses to remarry. A girl who fakes illness to delay a wedding. A midwife who forgets to inform the church about a stillbirth. A merchant's wife who secretly funds her cousins. Flight from an abusive husband. You pass a shop at Taylor's. From the look of Itan Peak, inside, a woman is measuring cloth, her face serene, her fingers steady. But look closer. There's a ledger hidden beneath a pile of linens, and in it, you see entries that don't match the official records. Someone's smuggling goods, or hiding profits, or laundering money for the local widows' collective. It's subtle, effective. Medieval cities had guilds, those tight-knit organizations of tradespeople, and occasionally, women were members, weavers, silk workers, brewers. Some even held property in the guild's name. One famous case from Cologne involves a woman brewer who refused to sell her recipe, sued the guild, and won. Twice. That's not a woman lost to time. That's a business shark in a WIMPL. In another house nearby, 2 women are binding books. Their fingers are inks, their voices low. One reads aloud from a passage she's copied. For she who endures long in silence shall inherit the earth. They both pause, laugh bitterly. The phrase isn't scripture. It's something they made up. But it fits. You sit with them for a moment, imagining all the small, undocumented ways women pushed against their constraints. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to fake sleep during prayers. A cook who spices the Lord's meat extra hot when he's in a foul mood. A nun who pretends not to hear confessions clearly so she can forget what no one should have to carry. There's a fringe historical theory that women passed down covert wisdom codes hidden in embroidery. Recipes with double meanings, lullabies, that mapped safe routes through dangerous streets. Hard to prove, easy to believe. You pass a wall with crude graffiti, a woman's face, exaggerated, laughing. Beneath it, a line. She knew and said nothing. It's not Latin, not formal, but it's truth. At the edge of town, you reach a gallows platform, empty now, but heavy with memory. This was where accused witches stood, where women too sharp, too loud, too different met ends too soon, but also where the crowd sometimes murmured, she didn't deserve this. Sometimes even louder. You think again of Margot, of the nun with ink on her sleeves, of the peasant who turned away from the Lord's demands with a raised eyebrow and a spoon in her hand. These aren't heroes in the epic sense. They're inconvenient, unwritten, untidy. But they held the line. Before you leave, you walk past a graveyard. The headstones are crooked. Most are nameless. A few are marked with simple crosses, some with just a pair of initials. Among them lies an entire history. Every woman who raised someone else's child, who sewed her rage into hymns, who prayed and cursed and healed and broke rules. Not saints, not villains, not props in someone else's story. Just women. Living, enduring, fighting often without anyone ever knowing. The moon hangs low now, tired like everything else. But your journey isn't over, not yet. You've seen the women who labored, who prayed, who healed, who defied. But there's another realm that shaped medieval women's lives, one far stranger, slipperier, more symbolic. You find it not in streets or fields, but in pages, in paintings, in stained glass and songs. Welcome to the world of legend. You're in a library now. Not the dusty, hushed kind you picture with scholars and wool cloaks. This one is brighter, full of clutter-illuminated manuscripts scattered across a wooden desk, pigment jars on every surface, A small window cracked open to the night. Someone's working here. A woman, naturally. She dips her brush, leans in, and paints the face of a saint with steady hands. She's done this before. Her name might be Anna, or Marie. She's a scribe's daughter, or maybe a nun in training, who couldn't quite keep her vows, but kept the ink. She illustrates the lives of holy women, of queens, of martyrs. And between the margins, and the decorative flourishes, she sneaks in something else. A woman with a fox's tail. A crowned mother nursing twins. A girl swinging a sword, too large for her frame. This is where medieval women lived when they couldn't live anywhere else. Inside allegory. You see them in tapestries, as unicorn tamers, as queens cloaked in sorrow, as Eve offering apples with a grin that somehow says asterisk you, we're going to do this anyway. Asterisk. And here's where it gets interesting. Some of those stories were written by women, or rewritten by them, or whispered into their children's ears until they became canon. Take the tale of Saint Margaret, for instance, swallowed by a dragon, and spit out alive because she carried a cross in her belly. Historians still argue whether that's a metaphor for pregnancy, or just medieval flair. But you can guess how that story landed with women who survived childbirth by chance. Then there's Hildegard of Bingen, who wasn't just a nun but a composer, a botanist, and a mystic who claimed her visions came from God, but conveniently lined up with her political opinions. She wrote books full of glowing female figures and cosmic wombs. If anyone embodied divine feminine energy before the term existed, it was her. You flip through a manuscript now delicate, cracked, humming with the weight of time. A story unfolds. A maiden tricked into silence. A queen who must weave a tapestry in secret to save her brothers. A wife who outwits the devil, using only patience and salted fish. None of these women are real, but somehow they're all true. In a stained glass panel nearby, a woman stands in a tower, hair like flame, a lion at her feet. Below her, two monks argue. One points to scripture, the other to her image. She doesn't look at either of them. Medieval art loved to box women in literally. Panels, frames, altarpieces. But even in those confines, women looked out. Sometimes bashful, sometimes bored, sometimes with a gaze so direct it makes your spine tingle. You think again of that manuscript illuminator, bent over her work by candlelight. Her world is small 2 rooms, a prayer schedule, maybe 1 walk a week. But her mind goes everywhere. She paints a woman bathing in stars, another sleeping under the ribs of a whale, another climbing a rope made of hair into the clouds. It's not realism, it's resistance. Dreaming as subversion. Some texts even recorded dreams, actual dreams, in which women spoke to angels, argued with saints, or occasionally punched the devil. Marjorie Kemp, emotional roller coaster that she was, once claimed Christ told her to wear white forever and cry in public, and while that sounds unhinged, people listened. She wrote it down. She became a literary figure in her own right. You find a poem tucked inside a binding. No title, just a handful of lines in Middle English. Scrawled in a woman's hand. Asterisk, my tongue is small, but burns like flax. My thoughts are crows upon the stacks. If none shall write, I still shall speak with spindle, pot, and ovens reek. Asterisk, there it is, again the truth, that legend and labor are not opposites. They're cousins. And women lived in both. A quirky tidbit for you. Some medieval bestiaries. Those delightful catalogues of real and imaginary animals included women as entries under Miracle of Creation, Dangerous Beauty, or Creature with 2 faces. Flattering. Not really. But sometimes, those entries turned on their authors. One scribe added a note in the margin. She saw this text and laughed. You hope she did. You wander through this library of imagination, touching words written, under duress, under rules, under threat and still, written anyway. You notice a pattern. The powerful women are punished. The clever ones are misunderstood. The kind ones are killed. And yet, they're still there, inked into eternity. It's worth remembering. History was written mostly by men. But stories, those belong to whoever keeps telling them. And women told stories while spinning wool, while making cheese, while bleeding, while dying. while praying for anything except obedience. You close the book. The candle gutters. The painted saint on the wall seems to wink. Because here, in the realm of dreams, women were free to imagine what reality never let them have. Agency, adventure, even revenge. And in doing so, they carved out a hidden kingdom just beneath the surface of the real one. You step back out into the night, unsure whether anything you just saw was real, but deeply certain that it mattered. You leave the library of dreams behind, and the cool air feels sharper now, like reality gently tugging you back. But as you wander through the quiet, cobbled lanes, you realize something stranger. Not walking toward a destination anymore. You're walking through echoes, memories that don't quite fade, footsteps that don't leave prints. The last place you're headed isn't a cottage or cloister. It's the archive of what women left behind. Not the grand chronicles or the king's ledgers. No, you're entering the realm of the everyday relic, the scraps, the scribbles, the things no one meant to preserve. But they did anyway. You start in a kitchen, not a modern one. Obviously there's no stainless steel or refrigerator magnets, but a stone room lit by a fire that never quite dies. On the table, a wooden spoon, worn smooth, where a thumb once rested every night. Next to it, a linen cloth embroidered, not with flowers, but with letters, EMA, perhaps initials, perhaps a secret. The thread is darkened with time, but still, holding dot in medieval homes, it wasn't the grand furniture or family crests that told the story. It was things like this: tokens, charms, tools, passed from one woman to another, with quiet ritual. A comb tucked in a daughter's trousseau. A knife handed over with whispered advice. A set of measuring cups marked not by numbers, but by memory. This one for feast days. This one when flour is short. You see a pair of shoes by the hearth, hand-stitched leather, cracked at the toe, patched at the heel. Someone walked in those 4 years. Someone danced in them once. 2, you can tell from the faint scuff at the sole's edge. They're not beautiful, but they are precious. Historians still argue whether these domestic traces count as history. But every stain on a garment, every worn-down spindle, every spoon chewed at the edge by a nervous child, each is a fossil of a life fully lived. Not catalogued, not footnoted, but real. You follow the trail to a chest in the corner. It creaks open with the sigh of centuries. Inside, a few letters tied in a cloth. Not love letters, supply orders maybe. Notes about debts owed, or favors returned. One line stands out. Tell her the cheese was enough. Enough for what? For forgiveness. For survival. For a second chance. You'll never know. But someone once needed that message. Now you're in a tiny garden behind the house. The plants are wild, but familiar: sage, thyme, feverfew. This isn't a noble's ornamental rosebed. This is practical. Healing. Ritual. There's a rusted trowel stuck in the dirt. Its handle worn to a perfect fit in someone's palm. A fence mended with bone needles and string. And on the wall, scratched so faintly you almost miss it, a name. Or maybe a prayer. Or both. This was someone's sanctuary. Their workspace. Their altar. Their resistance. You're guided next into a corner of a church where the sunlight filters through a pane of stained glass, tiny, cracked, mostly ignored. But in its corner is the profile of a woman's face. No name, no inscription. Just a look of fierce concentration, eyes narrowed, lips parted. She's weaving, and even though the scene is small and blurry with age, it pulses with life. Someone painted her that way on purpose. Further down the nave, you find another relic. A single glove, crushed between the pages of a forgotten psalter. It's delicate, lace-trimmed, and stitched with thread so fine you suspect it came from Venice. You wonder whose hand wore it, what gesture it last made. Was it dropped by accident, hidden on purpose, left behind during flight? And then, the voices begin again, not out loud, but from objects all around you. A comb whispers about grooming a daughter before her wedding. A scarf smells faintly of rosemary, used in mourning or memory. A broken bracelet, strung with painted beads, once clinked on someone's wrist as she kneaded dough. None of it is flashy. None of it meant to impress kings or rewrite laws. But it lasted, and by surviving, it refused to be forgotten. One quirky little item catches your eye, a doll, carved from driftwood and dressed in rags. You pick it up and feel a rush of emotion you can't quite name. Love, maybe, or fear, or comfort. A child once held this through a storm, maybe even a siege. A mother might have stitched its clothes by candlelight, while the rest of the house slept. It occurs to you that medieval women didn't always record themselves in ink. They used thread, ash, rhythm, and repetition. They didn't always write history. They lived it, layered in quilts and basketry, layered in meals cooked 100 times and never written down. Even silence was a record. What isn't said in the official documents, the gaps, the erasures, the passive voices, that's where the truth lingers. Before you go, you sit one last time by a hearth, not for warmth, but for memory. You look at the iron pot, the cracked ladle, the stool worn low in the middle. You think of every woman who sat here, staring at the same flames, wondering the same things. Asterisk, will the child recover? Will the bread rise? Will he come home? Will anyone remember me? Asterisk, and here you are, remembering. You stand up, brush the ash from your clothes, and step back into the street. The wind has picked up, but it's soft now, like someone exhaling beside you. You don't see them, but you feel them walking with you. The scribe, the weaver, the midwife, the scold, the saint, the survivor. Not ghosts, not saints, not stories, told by men in robes, just women. Forgotten by history, but not by the world they helped build. The dawn is just beginning to smudge the sky, a hint of rose, a slow glow seeping between slate rooftops and chimney stacks. You've walked all night, shadowed by centuries of women who lived without statues or battle songs, who left no victory, parades, but somehow left everything. But before you let sleep take you, there's one last place to go. Not a sight, exactly. More like a moment. A threshold. You find yourself at a doorway, wooden, a little warped with age. Nothing about it looks remarkable. But as you step over the threshold, you understand what it is. A birth chamber. This is where life began for most people in the medieval world. Not in hospitals, not in polished royal chambers, but in spaces like this, cramped, warm, chaotic. The air inside is thick with herbs, heat, and hushed urgency. A woman lies on a straw mattress, her face pale, her jaw clenched. Around her, midwives, sisters, neighbors, maybe a traveling healer if she's lucky. They murmur instructions, pass cloths, boil water, not for sterilization, that's not a thing yet, but to soften towels and fill the air with steam. One of the women ties herbs above the bedroom, sage, maybe not medical, exactly, but calming, symbolic. Necessary. This isn't a sterile event. It's sweaty, painful, sacred, and terrifying. The woman grips the hands around her like they're the only things keeping her tethered to the world. She screams, not like in the movies. It's deeper, rougher, animal, and ancient. She's not just bringing life. She's risking death to do it. Historians still argue how often women died in childbirth. The numbers are fuzzy, scattered through parish records and prayer requests. But the fear, that was constant. Every pregnancy was a gamble. A child or a ghost. A cradle or a coffin. Women knew that. They always knew that. And yet, they did it anyway. You sit quietly as the room shifts. The baby arrives, slick and screaming, tiny and impossibly loud. The midwife wraps it in linen, then presses a hand to the mother's belly, murmuring something too low for you to catch. Another woman lights a candle and places it by the window. A sign, the birth was successful. A call to neighbors, to fate, to the sky itself. Someone laughs, someone cries. Someone begins to hum a lullaby that probably predates half the kings you've heard of. In this moment, the world starts over again, quietly, without medals, without proclamations. Just breath and blood, and a room full of women holding each other steady. You step back to let them work. Drawn toward the wall, where faint marks have been scratched. Names, maybe dates, maybe prayers. You trace them gently. The women who delivered life here may not be remembered, but they are not gone. You think of all the things women made, not just humans. Songs, potions, stories, stitches, patience. They wove the world behind the curtain while the scribes wrote about someone else. But the world, it knew. It carried their marks, soft and stubborn. There's one more thing in this room, near the fire. A cradle, carved with ivy and stars, worn smooth from decades of use. You glance inside. It's empty now, but the wood holds memory like breath. One generation after another passed through the space-born nursed, whispered to, carried off, remembered. You wonder if the mother will live. You wonder what name she'll give the child. You wonder how many stories that baby will carry in. Their bones. The women are cleaning now. The crisis is over. The miracle has happened, messy and mundane as it always is. And the sun has risen. You step outside, and the morning feels washed clean. Birds are waking. Smoke curls from chimneys. Someone somewhere is already kneading dough, or milking a goat, or pulling water from a frozen well. You look down at your hands and realize you're holding something, a cloth, maybe, or a figurine, or just a scrap of thread from all those women you've met. You don't remember picking it up, but you know you won't put it down. And now you rest. You lie back now, the sky above you softening from gray to gold, the hush of the medieval world folding in like a blanket. The echo of footsteps, of whispered prayers, of soft lullabies, all fades into something gentle, like breath, like tide, like time itself deciding to slow, just for you. You've traveled across centuries tonight. You've walked behind queens and midwives, nuns and servants, scribes and mothers. You've felt their fingers brushing past you as they kneaded bread, stitched cloth, crushed herbs, and etched hope into the margins of forgotten pages. Their lives weren't always loud, but they were never small. Some fought, some waited, some watched from the edge of rooms where decisions were made without them, but they remembered. And remembering is its own kind of power. Let your body sink deeper now. Let the noise of the present drift further away, like smoke leaving a chimney. In the early morning light, imagine the cradle rocking gently beside the hearth. Imagine the herbs hanging to dry above the door. Imagine the hum of women's voices murmuring not for you, but around you, like a tide you're safe to float in. And know this, every time you wonder what history left out, what voices were lost, what truths were buried beneath dates and battles, and stone monuments, you already know where to look. It's there in the kitchens, the birthrooms, the gardens, the hymns sung under breath. It's there in silence that isn't empty, but full. And now, let that silence carry you. No questions, left no steps to follow. Just the soft warmth of stories settling in your chest, and sleep.